Picture a fleet of Viking longships slicing through waves under an endless sky, their sails taut with wind as they push further into the unknown. These were not just raiders in horned helmets, though history often paints them that way, but some of the most daring explorers the world has ever seen. While Europe knew them as fearsome warriors, the Vikings were also master navigators who ventured far beyond their homelands, driven by an insatiable curiosity and a hunger for discovery. What compelled these Norse adventurers to leave behind familiar shores and sail into uncharted waters? The answer lies in a story far grander than pillaging and plunder. It's a tale of ambition, resilience, and a thirst for the extraordinary. From the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the sun-baked coasts of North Africa, Viking expeditions stretched across continents most Europeans had never even imagined. They didn't just stumble upon new lands, they sought them out, navigating by the stars, trading with distant cultures, and leaving their mark on places as far-flung as the Middle East and even North America. Imagine standing on the deck of a longship, gazing at a horizon that promised nothing but mystery. For the Vikings, every voyage was a leap into the impossible, a test of skill and courage that reshaped the medieval world. This is the story of those journeys, 20 of the most astonishing Viking expeditions outside Europe, each one a testament to human ingenuity and the spirit of exploration. We'll trace their footsteps to places you might never have guessed they reached, uncovering the secrets of their travels and the legacies they left behind. Forget the stereotypes. By the end of this journey, you'll see the Vikings in a whole new light, not just as warriors, but as pioneers who dared to go where no one else would. So ready yourself for an adventure through time, because history is about to surprise you. Long before Columbus set sail across the Atlantic, a Viking explorer named Leif Erikson made history by stepping onto the shores of North America, a land he called Vinland after the wild grapes that grew there in abundance. This wasn't just a chance encounter, it was the culmination of generations of Norse seafaring skill and daring. According to the Icelandic sagas, Erikson heard tales of a mysterious western land from another Viking, Bioni Herjolfson, who'd glimpsed it after being blown off course. Intrigued, Erikson gathered a crew and set out to find it himself, navigating treacherous waters with little more than the sun, stars, and his instincts to guide him. When Eriksson's longship finally reached Vinland around the year 1000, he found a place unlike anything the Vikings had seen before: rolling green hills, dense forests, and rivers teeming with fish. The sagas describe it as a land so rich that livestock could graze freely all winter without fodder, a paradise compared to the harsh landscapes of Greenland and Iceland. But this wasn't just a story. Modern archaeology has proven it true. In the 1960s, researchers uncovered the remains of a Viking settlement at Elance Orks Meadows in Newfoundland, complete with iron nails, wooden artifacts, and the unmistakable outline of Norse-style turf houses. This wasn't a fleeting visit. It was a base camp, evidence that Erikson and his crew stayed long enough to explore and even attempt to establish a foothold. So why didn't the Vikings stay? The sagas hint at conflicts with the indigenous peoples they called Skraelings, likely the ancestors of today's Micmac or Beothuk nations. Clashes over trade, misunderstandings, or territorial disputes made the settlement unsustainable. But there's another factor: the sheer distance from their homeland. Maintaining a colony across the stormy North Atlantic with no support network was a logistical nightmare. Without enough settlers or resources to defend their claim, the Vikings eventually abandoned Vinland, leaving behind only whispers of their journey. Yet this brief chapter reshapes our understanding of history. Imagine if Erikson's settlement had thrived, how differently the story of the Americas might have unfolded. Instead of a footnote, Vinland could have been the start of a Norse New World. But even as a fleeting venture, Erikson's voyage stands as a testament to Viking ambition. They didn't just raid and trade, they pushed the boundaries of the known world, proving that the Atlantic was not an endless void but a gateway to new horizons. It would take nearly 500 years for another European to match their achievement, and by then, the Vikings' legacy in Vinland had faded into legend until archaeology brought it back to light. Thorf Karlsefni's voyage to Vinland was no mere follow-up to Leif Erikson's discovery. It was a full-scale attempt to turn adventure into permanence. A wealthy Icelandic merchant with a knack for leadership, Karlsefni saw Vinland not just as a curiosity but as a land of opportunity. Around the year 1010, he assembled a fleet of 3 ships carrying over 160 men, women, and even livestock, determined to build a sustainable colony. This wasn't a raiding party or a seasonal camp. It was a deliberate effort to plant Norse roots in the New World. The sagas paint a vivid picture of their early days: lush fields ripe for farming, forests abundant with game, and shores so thick with salmon that they could barely wade through the water. For a time, it seemed the Vikings had found their promised land, but paradise quickly gave way to peril. The same indigenous communities Leif's crew had encountered, likely ancestors of the Micmac or Beothuk, viewed the newcomers with growing suspicion. Initial trade exchanges, where the Norse offered red cloth and milk in return for furs, soon soured. Cultural misunderstandings spiraled into violence when a Viking bull, unfamiliar to the locals, charged through their camp, sparking a clash that left several dead on both sides. The sagas describe a tense stalemate, with the Norse building palisades for defense while facing relentless skirmishes. For Karlsefni, the dream of coexistence crumbled under the weight of mutual distrust. What's striking is how differently this played out compared to later European colonization. The Vikings lacked 2 critical advantages: numbers and guns. Without overwhelming force or immunity to local diseases, they couldn't dominate the land as Spanish or English settlers later would. Their failure wasn't just about conflict, it was a logistical collapse. The colony was too isolated, too small, and too vulnerable. When Karlsefni's wife, Gudrid, gave birth to their son Snorri, the first known European child born in the Americas, it should have been a symbol of hope. Instead, it became a footnote in a retreat. Within 3 years, the Norse abandoned Vinland for good, their ships heavy with timber and pelts but empty of the future they'd envisioned. Had they succeeded, the map of the Americas might look unrecognizable today. A thriving Norse Vinland could have reshaped trade routes, alliances, and even the biological exchange of plants and animals centuries before Columbus. But history favors the persistent, and the Vikings' fleeting presence left no lasting imprint until archaeologists unearthed their story. Karlsefni's attempt stands as a haunting what if, a reminder that exploration alone isn't enough. To conquer a new world, you need more than courage, you need the means to stay. Eric the Red didn't just stumble upon Greenland, he turned exile into empire. Banished from Iceland for manslaughter around the year 982, this fiery-haired chieftain sailed westward, determined to find a land rumored by earlier Norse explorers. What he discovered was a frozen wilderness of towering glaciers and jagged fjords, a place so inhospitable he shrewdly named it Greenland to lure settlers. It worked. By 986, he'd returned with 25 ships of hopeful colonists, though only 14 survived the treacherous journey. These were the first Europeans to carve out a life in the Arctic, and their story is one of sheer audacity. The Norse didn't just survive in Greenland, they thrived, at least for a while. They built two main settlements, the eastern settlement near modern-day Qaqortoq and the western settlement closer to Nuuk. Despite the brutal winters, they raised sheep, cattle, and even grew barley in the short summers. They constructed sturdy stone and turf homes with central hearths to ward off the cold, and their churches, like the imposing Herjolfson Fjord Church, stood as symbols of their enduring faith. Trade kept them connected to Europe, with ships exporting walrus ivory, furs, and even live polar bears, prized gifts for kings. For nearly 400 years, the Greenland Norse clung to their way of life, a testament to human resilience in one of the planet's most unforgiving environments. Yet by the mid-15th century, their settlements had vanished, leaving behind only ruins and unanswered questions. What doomed them? Climate change looms large in the theories. The Little Ice Age, which began in the 13th century, made farming even harder as growing seasons shortened and pack ice choked the fjords. Trade routes faltered as ships struggled to reach them. But there's more to the story. Recent archaeology suggests the Norse stubbornly clung to European customs, refusing to fully adopt Inuit hunting techniques that might have saved them. While the Inuit thrived on seal and whale, the Norse relied on livestock, a choice that grew increasingly disastrous as pastures failed. Then there's the question of conflict. The sagas mention skirmishes with the Inuit, whom the Norse called Skraelings, though whether these clashes were deadly or merely tense encounters remains debated. Some scholars argue the Norse may have simply given up, sailing back to Iceland as their world shrank. Others point to evidence of malnutrition in skeletal remains, hinting at a slow, grim decline. Whatever the truth, their disappearance wasn't sudden but a slow unraveling, a cautionary tale about adaptation and the limits of human endurance. Greenland's Norse left no grand monuments or written records of their final days. Their end was as quiet as a snowdrift burying an abandoned farmstead. Yet their legacy lingers in the very idea of Arctic colonization, a daring experiment that proved even the harshest corners of the Earth could for a time be called home. Eric the Red's gamble bought centuries of survival, but in the end, Greenland's icy grip proved stronger than Viking resolve. The silence of their ruins whispers a timeless lesson. Civilization is fragile, and no amount of courage can outlast a changing world. Sometimes the greatest discoveries happen by accident. Just ask Bioni Herjolfson. In the summer of 986, this young Norse trader set sail from Iceland, bound for Greenland to visit his father. But fate had other plans. A savage storm engulfed his ship, tossing it westward for days until the fog lifted, and there, through the mist, loomed an unknown coastline. Rolling forest stretched as far as the eye could see, nothing like the icy cliffs of Greenland. Bioni had just become the first European to lay eyes on North America, centuries before Leif Erikson or Columbus. Yet what he did next would shape Viking history in ways no one could have predicted. Instead of landing, Bioni ordered his crew to turn away. The sagas claim he was a man of little curiosity, more focused on reuniting with his father than exploring strange shores. For 3 days they skirted the coast, first a wooded land, then a flat, glacier-free territory, and finally a rugged island before correcting course and reaching Greenland. At the time, it seemed like a missed opportunity, but Bioni's choice speaks volumes about Viking priorities. These weren't reckless adventurers, they were pragmatic navigators who respected the sea's dangers. Without charts or knowledge of local threats, landing could have meant disaster. What makes Bioni's voyage extraordinary isn't just the sighting, it's how his story became a roadmap for others. Years later, Leif Erikson would seek out the aging Bioni, buying his ship and grilling him for details about those mysterious lands. Those conversations lit a fire in Lafe, proving the Atlantic wasn't an endless void but a gateway to something new. Bioni's descriptions, so precise that scholars still debate whether he glimpsed Newfoundland, Labrador, or even New England, gave Lafe the confidence to sail west with purpose. This accidental discovery also reveals the Vikings' unmatched seafaring skills. Imagine navigating open oceans with no compass, just a sunstone to polarize sunlight and crude landmarks like migratory birds. Bioni's ability to reorient after weeks adrift shows how deeply Norse sailors understood wind patterns and currents. They didn't just survive the North Atlantic, they mastered it, turning a wrong turn into a legend. History remembers Leif Erikson as the Viking who reached America, but without Bioni's reluctant reconnaissance, that milestone might never have happened. His journey reminds us that exploration isn't always about bold landings. Sometimes it's the cautious observers who change the world. By choosing not to step ashore, Bioni did something equally vital. He left a trail of breadcrumbs for others to follow. The Viking raid on Lisbon in the year 844 was no ordinary coastal attack. It marked the moment Norse longships burst into the Mediterranean world, shattering the illusion that Al-Andalus was safe from northern barbarians. Sailing down the Atlantic coast with a fleet of around 100 ships, the Vikings bypassed Christian kingdoms entirely, targeting the wealthy Muslim-held city at the mouth of the Tagus River. Lisbon, then called Al-Ashbuna, was a glittering prize, a hub of trade where gold, silk, and scholars flowed between North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. The Norse struck without warning, their sudden appearance as shocking as a winter storm in the desert. For weeks, they rampaged through the city, looting mosques, capturing slaves, and fighting off local forces in brutal street battles. Islamic chroniclers described them as blue-eyed demons who moved like shadows, vanishing back to their ships before counterattacks could rally. But this wasn't just mindless violence, it was a calculated strike against a civilization far more advanced than their own. The Vikings didn't just take treasures, they absorbed knowledge. In Lisbon's workshops, they saw Arabic astrolabes for navigation, intricate metalworking tools, and medical texts that would have been unimaginable in Scandinavia. Some historians speculate these raids were reconnaissance missions disguised as plunder, a way to map the riches of the Islamic world for future ventures. The aftermath rippled across two cultures. For Al-Andalus, the attack was a wake-up call. The Umayyad emir, Abd al-Rahman II, responded by fortifying ports and building a naval fleet, Europe's first standing navy, to deter future raids. Meanwhile, the Vikings carried home more than gold. They introduced Islamic silver coins to Scandinavia's economy. Some melted down into arm rings, others stamped with Arabic script that baffled Norse traders. Even their art changed. Intricate geometric patterns began appearing on Viking jewelry, a subtle echo of the arabesques they'd seen in Andalusi metalwork. What makes this raid extraordinary isn't the destruction, but the cultural collision. The Vikings, often portrayed as isolated raiders, were suddenly players in a global medieval network stretching from Baghdad to Dublin. They didn't just terrorize Lisbon, they learned from it, taking back ideas that would shape their own society for generations. When they returned decades later, it wasn't as raiders but as mercenaries, hired by Muslim rulers to fight their Christian rivals. The Lisbon attack wasn't an end. It was the first thread in a tangled web of diplomacy and exchange that proved even the fiercest enemies could become reluctant partners. This raid forces us to rethink the Viking Age. They weren't just predators at the edges of civilization. They were its keenest observers, stealing not just wealth but the very innovations that would propel their world forward. The blue-eyed demons of Lisbon left scars, but they also wove themselves into the fabric of history, proving that even violence could be a bridge between worlds. The journey eastward to Constantinople was no less treacherous than sailing west to Vinland, but for ambitious Vikings, it promised rewards far beyond plunder. By the late 10th century, Norse warriors had carved a new path across rivers and steppes, trading their longships for the golden halls of Byzantine emperors. These weren't just hired swords, they became the Varangian Guard, an elite brotherhood of foreign bodyguards whose loyalty was so fierce they were known as the Emperor's axe-bearers. Imagine the scene: towering Norse fighters in gleaming armor, their two-handed axes resting on shoulders as they stood guard beside the most powerful ruler in Christendom. For a Viking, this wasn't just service, it was a gateway to wealth, prestige, and a front-row seat to history. At the heart of this story is Harald Hardrada, a man whose life reads like a saga itself. Exiled from Norway after a failed rebellion at 15, he fled eastward with a band of loyal warriors, joining the Varangians in their campaigns across the Mediterranean. Hardrada didn't just blend in, he thrived. Byzantine chroniclers describe his exploits in Sicily, Bulgaria, and even Jerusalem, where he fought not just as a mercenary but as a strategist. His signature weapon, a massive axe he wielded with terrifying precision, became legendary. But the real prize wasn't battle glory. It was the chests of Byzantine gold he amassed, wealth that would later fuel his bid for the Norwegian throne. The Varangians were more than warriors, they were cultural conduits. While serving in Constantinople, Norse fighters absorbed Byzantine customs, their intricate court rituals, advanced military tactics, and even their faith. Many Varangians converted to Christianity, bringing back relics and religious artifacts that began reshaping Scandinavian spirituality. The influence flowed both ways. Byzantine emperors prized the Norsemen's unwavering loyalty, untouched by local political intrigues. When a coup threatened the throne, it was the Varangians who stormed the palace, their axes cutting down traitors without hesitation. Their motto might as well have been gold or death, a bond sealed by treasure and trust. Hardrada's return to Norway in the year 1045 marked the end of one adventure and the start of another. Using his Varangian wealth, he bribed, fought, and negotiated his way to power, becoming King Harald III. But Constantinople never left him. He introduced Byzantine administrative practices to his kingdom, minted coins inspired by imperial currency, and even planned his own version of the Varangian Guard. His ambitions didn't stop there. Years later, he would launch a disastrous invasion of England, dying at Stamford Bridge in 1066, his axe still in hand. The Varangian legacy outlived Hardrada. For nearly 300 years, Scandinavians streamed into Byzantine service, their names etched in Greek records as Rose or Varangoi. They left runes on the Hagia Sophia's marble walls, carried silk and spices back to icy homelands, and proved that Vikings could be more than raiders. They could be empire builders, diplomats, even scholars. The Guard's final act came in 1204, when they stood firm as crusaders sacked Constantinople, defending their adopted home to the last. Today, their story lingers in the echoes of axes on marble, a reminder that the Viking Age wasn't just about conquest, it was about connection. Ingvar the far traveler's name promised adventure, but his final voyage delivered tragedy on an epic scale. In the early 11th century, as the Viking Age waned, this Swedish chieftain assembled a fleet of 30 ships, filled with warriors and traders hungry for the riches of the East. Their route was audacious, down the winding rivers of Russia, portaging boats where waters grew shallow until they could spill into the vast Caspian Sea. This was no raid, it was a full-scale expedition, armed with iron ingots, amber, and furs to trade for the silks and silver of the Islamic world. But the Caspian, a labyrinth of shifting currents and rival empires, would become their graveyard. The journey began with promise. Sailing southeast from Sweden, Ingvar's fleet navigated the Volga River, a watery highway already familiar to Norse merchants. Past the bustling markets of Volga, where Viking traders haggled for Arabic dirhams, they pressed onward, their longships growing heavier with exotic goods. But beyond the Volga's mouth lay the unknown, a sea ruled by Khazar remnants and Seljuk Turks, where Christian, Muslim, and pagan interests collided. Here, the sagas grow murky. Some accounts suggest Ingvar's crew clashed with local tribes, their axes meeting scimitars in chaotic skirmishes. Others whisper of a more insidious foe, disease. The Caspian's marshy shores bred malaria, and Norse skeletons from this period show signs of chronic malnutrition, hinting at starvation as supplies dwindled. What makes Ingvar's story haunting isn't just the failure, it's the silence. Unlike Leif Erikson's Vinland or Harald Hardrada's Byzantine exploits, there were no survivors to bring tales home. The runestones of Sweden tell the aftermath, over 24 memorial stones erected by grieving families, all bearing the same eerie refrain. They died in the east with Ingvar. These carvings, scattered across the countryside, form Europe's first recorded missing persons campaign, a desperate attempt to make sense of a vanishing. Archaeology offers faint clues. Fragments of Norse weaponry found near the Caspian southern coast suggest some reached Persia, only to be absorbed into local mercenary bands. A handful of Islamic texts mention Rus warriors serving as bodyguards in cities like Ray, their blonde hair and tattoos marking them as outsiders, but Ingvar himself. He vanishes from history, leaving only his nickname, the Far Traveler, as a monument to ambition's limits. This doomed expedition reshaped Viking horizons. Though Ingvar's men never returned, their attempt proved the East wasn't just a land of rumor. It was a real, reachable world, albeit one that demanded a price too steep for most to pay. Future Norse traders would learn from Ingvar's mistakes, favoring diplomacy over force and alliances over conquest. His legacy wasn't gold or glory, but a warning etched in stone. The unknown rewards the prepared and devours the reckless. The Volga River was more than a waterway, it was a liquid highway of gold, stretching from the frozen forests of Scandinavia to the sun-baked markets of Baghdad. By the 9th century, Viking traders had mastered this route, transforming themselves from coastal raiders into savvy merchants who bridged two worlds. Their ships, laden with furs from the north and honey from Baltic apiaries, navigated a network of rivers and portages, dodging Slavic tolls and Khazar patrols until they reached the Caspian Sea. From there, camel caravans carried their goods south to the Abbasid Caliphate, where Norse amber and slaves fetched fortunes in silver dirhams. This wasn't just commerce, it was a cultural exchange that reshaped the medieval world. Among the most coveted treasures flowing north were Arabic silver coins, so abundant that over 85,000 have been unearthed in Sweden alone. These weren't mere currency, they were raw material. Viking smiths melted them into arm rings, necklaces, and ingots, their edges still bearing faint Quranic verses. Meanwhile, silk from Baghdad's looms became a status symbol for Norse elites, its shimmering threads woven into burial shrouds for chieftains. The Caliphate, in turn, prized Viking iron swords superior to local blades, and fair-haired slaves who fetched premium prices as household servants. The Volga trade turned the Norse into global players, their networks stretching from York to Samarkand. No account captures this collision of worlds more vividly than the writings of Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat sent north in 921. His journal describes Viking traders as perfect physical specimens, tall as palm trees, tattooed from fingertips to necks, with customs both fascinating and grotesque to Islamic eyes. He recoiled at their ritual sacrifices, yet admired their fierce loyalty in trade. One scene stands out, a Norse chieftain's funeral, where a slave girl volunteers to join her master in death, a ceremony so harrowing Fadlan called it the work of the devil. Yet, even as he judged, he documented, preserving details no Viking would have written down. These trade routes did more than move goods, they moved ideas. Arabic numerals and astronomical knowledge trickled north, while Norse myths of dragons and giants may have influenced Islamic folklore. The Volga Vikings even adopted elements of Muslim hygiene. Combs and ear spoons found in Swedish graves mirror Abbasid designs. But the trade's golden age couldn't last. By the 11th century, the caliphate's decline and the rise of Kievan Rus as middlemen squeezed the Norse out. The dirham stopped flowing and the Volga route faded into memory. What lingers is the legacy of these long-distance dealers. They proved the Viking world wasn't isolated, but plugged into a medieval globalization that connected continents. The next time you picture a Viking, don't just see a warrior, see a merchant haggling over silk in Baghdad's bazaars, his pockets jingling with coins that would one day be unearthed centuries later as proof of a world far more interconnected than we ever imagined. Hastine's name struck terror into the hearts of Mediterranean coastlines, not just for his brutality, but for his sheer audacity. In the year 859, this Viking chieftain sailed where no Norse raider had gone before, steering a fleet of 62 ships past the Pillars of Hercules and into the warm, wine-dark waters of the Mediterranean. This wasn't just a raid, it was a statement. While most Vikings clung to familiar northern waters, Hastine dared to challenge the naval powers of the south, proving that no corner of Europe was beyond their reach. His journey would become legendary, not just for its violence, but for the cunning that defined it. The Siege of Luna, a wealthy Italian town Hastine mistook for Rome, is the stuff of Viking myth. According to chroniclers, the Norse chieftain hatched a scheme so outrageous it could have been ripped from a saga. Feigning mortal illness, he had his men announce his death and beg the townspeople for a Christian burial within their walls. The ruse worked, as monks carried Hastine's corpse through the gates in a solemn procession. The Viking suddenly sprang from his coffin, axe in hand, while his hidden forces stormed the undefended city. Whether entirely true or embellished over time, the story captures Hastine's reputation as a master of deception. Luna fell in a single night, its treasures looted, its people enslaved or ransomed back to local lords. But Hastine's ambitions didn't stop at Italy. Sailing south, his fleet raided along the coasts of North Africa, striking at Muslim-held ports like Nekka in modern-day Morocco. Here, the Vikings weren't just pillagers, they were opportunists exploiting a fractured political landscape. The Emirate of Nekka was embroiled in rebellion, and Hastine's forces sacked the city with startling ease, carrying off gold, silks, and perhaps most valuably, prisoners to sell in European slave markets. These raids revealed a Viking leader who understood more than just warfare. He grasped the power of timing. By attacking during local upheavals, he minimized resistance and maximized plunder. What set Hastine apart wasn't just his tactics, it was his adaptability. In the Mediterranean, Norse longships faced unfamiliar challenges. Lighter warships manned by Arab and Byzantine sailors fortified stone cities unlike the wooden towns of the north, and scorching summer heat that tested their endurance. Yet Hastine's men adjusted swiftly, adopting captured vessels, negotiating with local factions, and even blending into regional conflicts as mercenaries. At one point, they allegedly offered their services to a Lombard prince in exchange for safe harbor, proving Vikings could be pragmatists as easily as predators. The long-term impact of these raids rippled across two continents. In Europe, Hastine's exploits forced coastal kingdoms to invest in stronger defenses, from watchtowers to chain barriers across harbors. In the Islamic world, chroniclers began documenting Magus heathen invaders from the north as a recurring threat, their accounts preserving some of the earliest detailed descriptions of Viking tactics. Even more fascinating are the artifacts left behind, Arabic coins found in Norse graves, possibly looted by Hastine's men, and Mediterranean glassware that made its way to Scandinavian trading posts like Hedeby. Hastine's final act was as dramatic as his career. After years of raiding, he returned to the Loire Valley in France, only to find his base camp destroyed by Frankish forces. Cornered, he negotiated a settlement, receiving land and even converting to Christianity, at least superficially, to secure peace. It was a pragmatic end for a man who'd spent his life bending rules. His story forces us to rethink the Viking Age. These weren't mindless barbarians, but shrewd strategists who could outmaneuver empires. When Hastine's longships finally vanished from history, they left behind a lesson. In the medieval world, the boldest often wrote their own rules, and sometimes their own legends. Before Iceland or Greenland, there were the Faroe Islands, a jagged cluster of volcanic peaks, rising from the North Atlantic like stepping stones placed by the gods. When Norse settlers arrived here in the early 9th century, they weren't just finding new land, they were testing the limits of Viking endurance. 18 islands, lashed by relentless winds and shrouded in fog for half the year, offered no forests for shipbuilding, no rich soil for easy farming, and no friendly ports for trade. Yet against all odds, the Vikings didn't just survive here. They built a society so resilient it still echoes in Faroes culture today. The sagas credit a man named Grimmer Kamben with leading the first settlement, though whether he was fleeing Norwegian tyranny or simply chasing opportunity remains a mystery. What's certain is that these pioneers arrived prepared. Unlike later colonists in Greenland, they brought sheep, lots of them animals bred for harsh climates that would become the backbone of Faroes' survival. The sheep didn't just provide wool and meat, they transformed the landscape. Vikings burned off native birch forests to create grazing land, a practice so effective that today, not a single original tree stands on the islands. But this wasn't recklessness, it was strategy. With no timber for building, the settlers turned to driftwood and salvaged ship planks, crafting homes with turf walls thick enough to defy Arctic gales. Isolation forced innovation. Faroes fishermen developed boats with deeper keels to navigate treacherous currents, while their wives perfected the art of wind-drying fish, a technique that preserved food for years without salt. They organized into tight-knit communes called bygds, where decisions were made collectively and resources shared, a necessity in a place where one bad storm could wipe out a family's food supply. Even their language evolved, blending Old Norse with Celtic influences from enslaved or married Irish women, creating a dialect still spoken today. The Faroes became more than a way station, they were a blueprint. Lessons learned here directly shaped later settlements in Iceland and Greenland. When Eric the Red set sail for Greenland's icy shores, he didn't go blindly. He carried knowledge of how to govern isolated communities, preserve food through endless winters, and negotiate with neighboring clans for survival. The Faroes model proved Vikings could thrive cut off from mainland Europe so long as they adapted. What's remarkable is how much of this Viking legacy endures. Modern pharaohs still gather in autumn for the grinder drop, a controversial but ancient pilot whale hunt conducted almost exactly as their ancestors did. Their medieval parliament, the Lagting, claims to be Europe's oldest continuous governing body, founded by Norse settlers over 1,000 years ago. Even the landscape bears Viking fingerprint stone markers called varðar still dot the hillsides, once used to guide sailors through fog, now protected as cultural treasures. The pharaohs remind us that Viking expansion wasn't just about conquest, it was about community. These islands weren't conquered, they were coaxed into fertility through sheer stubbornness. Every lamb grazing on windswept cliffs, every sod-roofed house clinging to the hillside, whispers the same truth. The Norsemen didn't just survive the North Atlantic. They mastered it, one storm-battered island at a time. North of Scandinavia, where the Arctic sun barely grazes the horizon in winter, the Vikings found a treasure more valuable than gold, walrus ivory. By the 9th century, Norse hunters were pushing their longships into the frozen embrace of the White Sea, a brutal expanse of water bordering what's now northern Russia. This wasn't casual exploration, it was a calculated gamble. The walrus herds here, particularly around the Solovetsky Islands, were massive, their tusks prized across Europe for carving into religious artifacts, chess pieces, and luxury goods. But harvesting them demanded more than courage. It required cooperation with the indigenous Sami people, whose knowledge of Arctic survival made them indispensable partners in this frigid enterprise. The Sami, skilled reindeer herders and hunters, had thrived in these lands for centuries before the Vikings arrived. Initially wary of the Norse newcomers, they soon recognized mutual benefit. Viking iron tools and weapons were traded for Sami expertise in tracking walrus across ice floes and navigating treacherous polar waters. Together, they developed hunting techniques that maximized the harvest, herding walruses onto beaches using noise and coordinated strikes, then processing the carcasses on site to preserve every ounce of valuable blubber and hide. The ivory trade became so lucrative that a single tusk could fetch the equivalent of a year's wages in Hebrides or Dublin, funding entire chieftains' ambitions back home. What's often overlooked is how these Arctic expeditions reshaped Viking society. The demand for ivory spurred innovations in shipbuilding, sturdier hulls to withstand ice, reinforced keels for shallow river mouths, that later enabled the Rus to dominate river trade routes deep into Russia. The Norse didn't just take from the White Sea, they left their mark. Archaeological digs have uncovered Norse-style pit houses and iron smelting sites along the coast, suggesting seasonal settlements where hunters overwintered. Even more telling are the Sami burials that began including Norse artifacts, evidence of cultural exchange that went beyond commerce. The legacy of this trade echoes in unexpected places. Some scholars argue that the Rus, the Viking-descended rulers of early Russia first, gained footholds in the east by following these Arctic supply lines southward. The same networks that moved ivory eventually transported furs, amber, and slaves, laying the economic foundation for cities like Novgorod. And when Christianity reached Scandinavia, it was walrus ivory that carved the crucifixes and reliquaries for new churches, tying the Arctic's wealth to Europe's spiritual transformation. Yet the cost was steep. The sagas speak of hunters lost to sudden blizzards, ships crushed by pack ice, and conflicts over dwindling herds. By the 12th century, overhunting had pushed walrus populations eastward, forcing Norse traders to venture farther into dangerous waters. The Sami, too, paid a price. Their traditional hunting grounds disrupted, their autonomy eroded by dependence on foreign goods. This wasn't just a trade route. It was a collision of worlds where survival balanced on a knife's edge of mutual need and competition. Today, the White Sea's Viking past lingers in place names, DNA, and the stubborn persistence of Arctic trade, the Sami still herd reindeer, their oral traditions preserving fragments of encounters with blue-eyed strangers from the sea. And in museums from Oslo to Moscow, walrus ivory artifacts gleam under glass, silent witnesses to an era when the farthest edge of the known world was worth every risk. The Vikings didn't just explore the Arctic, they bound it to global history, proving that even the harshest landscapes could shape civilizations. The Viking raid on Seville in 844 wasn't just another coastal strike, it was a full-scale invasion that shocked the Islamic world to its core. Sailing up the Guadalquivir River with a fleet of around 100 ships, the Norse bypassed smaller towns and headed straight for one of Al-Andalus's crown jewels, a bustling metropolis of towering minarets, sprawling markets, and fortified palaces. Seville was no easy target. As the regional capital, it boasted thick walls, a large garrison, and the protection of the Umayyad Emirate. Yet none of that stopped the Vikings. They struck with terrifying precision, breaching the city's defenses and sending its inhabitants fleeing in panic. For weeks, Seville was theirs to plunder, its mosques stripped of gold, its warehouses emptied of silks and spices, and its people dragged away in chains to be sold in distant slave markets. What made this raid extraordinary wasn't just the Vikings' audacity, it was their strategic brilliance. Unlike earlier hit-and-run attacks, they established a fortified base on Isla Mena, an island in the river, turning it into a staging ground for repeated assaults. From here, they launched raids up and down the coast, even threatening Cordoba itself, the heart of Umayyad power. Islamic chroniclers describe them as magus pagans who fought like demons, their axes cutting through armored cavalry with terrifying ease. But the Vikings weren't just warriors, they were keen observers. They quickly learned to navigate Andalusia's complex political landscape, exploiting divisions between local factions and even negotiating temporary alliances with rebel governors. This wasn't mindless violence, it was calculated warfare on a scale the Islamic world had never seen from northern raiders. The Umayyad response was swift and brutal. Emir Abd al-Rahman II rallied his forces, assembling an army that outnumbered the Vikings 10-1. What followed was a masterclass in medieval warfare. The Muslims deployed Greek fire, a devastating incendiary weapon, to burn Viking ships trapped in the river, while their cavalry harried the Norse on land. Cornered and outmaneuvered, the raiders fought a desperate retreat, their ranks thinning with every skirmish. By the time they reached the open sea, barely half their original force remained. But the emir wasn't done. Determined to prevent future attacks, he launched an unprecedented project, the construction of a standing navy, the first in Al-Andalus's history. Shipyards sprang up along the coast, producing sleek, fast galleys designed specifically to intercept Viking longships. Watchtowers dotted the shoreline, linked by a relay system of signal fires that could alert Seville of approaching fleets within hours. The long-term impact of this raid stretched far beyond military innovation. The Vikings may have been driven out, but their brief occupation left an indelible mark. Arabic coins minted in Seville during this period suddenly vanished from circulation, likely carried off as plunder, creating an economic ripple effect felt as far as North Africa. Meanwhile, Norse captives brought to Cordoba introduced Andalusia to Scandinavian metalworking techniques, their intricate patterns influencing local artisans. Most fascinating of all are the accounts of Muslim scholars who studied Viking prisoners, recording everything from their religious rituals to their shipbuilding methods. These writings, preserved in libraries across the Islamic world, became some of the earliest detailed descriptions of Norse culture from outside observers. Seville's ordeal forced the Islamic world to confront an uncomfortable truth. no one was safe from the Viking threat. The emir's naval reforms didn't just protect Al-Andalus, they reshaped Mediterranean warfare, setting a precedent that would inspire later Muslim dynasties. And for the Vikings, the raid proved something equally profound. Even the mightiest civilizations could be humbled. When they returned to Iberia decades later, it wasn't as raiders but as mercenaries, hired by rival emirs to fight their own kin. The attack on Seville wasn't just a raid, it was the moment the Vikings became players in a global game, their axes rewriting the rules of engagement across continents. Deep in the heart of Eurasia, where the Volga River meets the Caspian Sea, the Vikings found an empire unlike any other, the Khazar Khaganate. This wasn't just another stop on their trade routes. It was a gateway to the Silk Road, a sprawling network of commerce linking Europe to the distant markets of China and Persia. The Khazars, a semi-nomadic Turkic people, ruled this crossroads with a unique blend of steppe tradition and cosmopolitan flair. By the 9th century, their capital at Itil had become a melting pot of languages, religions, and goods, where Jewish merchants haggled with Muslim traders under the watchful eyes of Khazar officials. And into this vibrant world sailed the Vikings, their longships heavy with northern treasures, ready to carve out a share of the wealth. The Norse didn't arrive as conquerors here, they came as deal-makers. Their most sought-after commodity, slaves, captured in raids across the Baltic and Slavic lands. Khazar markets prized these captives, especially fair-haired women and children, who commanded high prices as domestic servants or concubines in Abbasid Baghdad. In return, the Vikings loaded their ships with Islamic silver dirhams, their chests overflowing with coins stamped with Arabic script. But human lives weren't the only currency. Furs from Scandinavian forests, sable, fox, and beaver, were traded by the bale, bundled alongside amber and walrus ivory to adorn the robes of Khazar elites. The sagas barely mention these exchanges, but archaeology tells the story. Hordes of Khazar-era silver buried across Sweden, some coins even repurposed into Norse jewelry, their inscriptions worn smooth from handling. What set the Khazar trade apart was its sheer scale. Unlike the hit-and-run raids in Western Europe, this was a sustained economic relationship. Norse traders established semi-permanent outposts along the Volga, like the settlement at Timrevo, where excavations have unearthed everything from Arabian glass to Byzantine silk. The Khazars, for their part, provided safe passage through their territory, charging tolls but also offering protection from rival steppe tribes. This wasn't just business, it was diplomacy. Some Viking chieftains even sent envoys to the Khagans' court, bringing gifts of weaponry in exchange for trade privileges. A few may have converted to Judaism, the Khazar state religion, if only to strengthen commercial ties. The cultural exchange went both ways. Khazar artifacts began appearing in Norse graves, intricate belt buckles, sabers with curved blades unlike anything in Scandinavia, even the occasional snippet of Hebrew script scratched onto a runestone. Meanwhile, the Khazars adopted Norse military technology, recruiting Viking mercenaries as bodyguards and shipbuilders. At Itil, Norse axes became status symbols among the Khazar nobility, their owners flaunting them as proof of connections to the far north. Yet this golden age couldn't last. By the 10th century, the rise of Kievan Rus, a Slavic kingdom heavily influenced by Vikings, disrupted the balance of power. The Rus sacked Itil in 965, scattering the Khazar elite and severing the trade routes that had enriched both peoples. But the legacy of this partnership endured. The silver that flowed north funded the rise of Viking towns like Birka and Hedeby, while Khazar-influenced art styles lingered in Scandinavian metalwork for generations. Most importantly, the Khazar trade proved the Vikings weren't just raiders, they were networkers, capable of navigating the complex politics of empires far from home. Their dealings with the Cognate opened doors to the east that would shape Eurasia for centuries, long after the last longship vanished from the Caspian shores. Iceland wasn't just another Viking colony, it was a social experiment forged in fire and ice. When Norse settlers began arriving in the late 9th century, they weren't merely escaping the overbearing rule of King Harald Fairhair in Norway, they were crafting a new society from scratch. Unlike the fleeting ventures in Vinland or the slow collapse in Greenland, Iceland's story is one of astonishing resilience and innovation. Picture this, a land where glaciers sprawl like frozen giants, volcanoes smolder beneath black sand deserts, and hot springs steam in the midnight sun. This was no place for the faint-hearted, yet within decades, the Vikings transformed it into a thriving republic, complete with the world's oldest surviving parliament. The key to their success lay in adaptation. Unlike Greenland's Norse, who clung stubbornly to European farming methods, Iceland's settlers embraced flexibility. They brought sheep, sure, but also recognized that fishing would be their lifeline. Coastal waters teemed with cod and herring, while inland rivers offered salmon so plentiful they could be speared by hand. Even the lack of timber, a crisis for shipbuilding, spurred creativity. Instead of longships, they perfected smaller, sturdier boats called nars, ideal for navigating Iceland's treacherous fjords. And when winter howled across the landscape, they turned geothermal energy to their advantage, bathing in natural hot pools and using steam vents to bake bread underground. But the real marvel wasn't just survival, it was governance. In the year 930, chieftains gathered at Thingvellir, a dramatic rift valley where tectonic plates pull Europe and America apart to establish the Althing. This wasn't just a council, it was a radical experiment in democracy. Free men, yes, only men, this was still the Viking Age, could voice disputes, pass laws, and even banish troublemakers through a process called outlawry. No kings, no emperors, just a collective of farmers and fishermen debating under open skies. The Althing's legacy endures today. Iceland's modern parliament still bears its name, a direct line from Viking Age debates to contemporary politics. Cultural preservation flourished in this isolation. Without cities or invading armies to disrupt them, Iceland's Norse became medieval Europe's premier storytellers. The saga's epic tales of heroes, feuds, and doomed love were penned here, preserving Old Norse myths that might have vanished elsewhere. Snorri Sturluson, a 13th century Icelandic chieftain, compiled the prose Edda, our primary source for Viking mythology, ensuring Odin, Thor, and Loki would outlive their worshippers. This literary golden age didn't just happen, it was born from Iceland's unique stability. While continental Europe burned libraries during wars, Icelandic scribes huddled in turf houses, their ink freezing as they wrote. The contrast with Vinland and Greenland couldn't be starker. In Vinland, the Norse faced indigenous resistance and logistical nightmares. In Greenland, climate change and cultural rigidity doomed them. But Iceland, here, the Vikings adapted too thoroughly to fail. They married Celtic slaves, absorbing Gaelic traditions into their language and DNA. They worshipped Christ and Thor in the same generation, pragmatically swapping gods when it suited them. Most importantly, they treated the land not as a conquest but as a partner, learning its rhythms, respecting its fury, and bending without breaking. Today, Iceland's Viking roots are everywhere, in place names ending in Vik, Bay, and Fjord, in the annual ratia where sheep are rounded up much as they were 1,000 years ago, even in the stubborn independence of its people. The lesson is clear. The Vikings didn't just survive in Iceland because they were tough. They thrived because they were willing to change, and in doing so, they built a legacy that outlasted empires. The Hebrides and Isle of Man weren't just way stations for Viking raiders, they became crucibles where Norse and Celtic cultures fused into something entirely new. When longships first appeared off these windswept islands in the late 8th century, the Picts and Gaels who lived there saw them as harbingers of doom. But within generations, the raiders had become settlers, their presence so deeply woven into the landscape that today, place names like Lewis and Skye bear the unmistakable stamp of Old Norse. This wasn't a conquest, it was a cultural alchemy that transformed both invaders and locals, leaving behind a legacy etched in stone, silver, and saga. Archaeology tells the story best. On the Isle of Man, the iconic Thor's cross at Kirk Michael stands as a perfect symbol of this blend, a Christian cross carved with scenes from Norse mythology, its runes praising both Christ and Thor in the same breath. Nearby at Peel Castle, excavations revealed a Viking ship burial with a twist. The deceased wore a Celtic brooch beside his sword, suggesting a warrior who'd married into local royalty. These finds paint a picture far more nuanced than simple pillage. The Norse didn't just dominate the Hebrides and Man, they intermarried, traded, and even adopted Celtic customs, creating a hybrid society scholars call the Norse Gaels. Strategic necessity drove this cultural fusion. Control of these islands gave the Vikings an iron grip on the sea lanes between Ireland, Scotland, and England. From bases like Dublin and the Isle of Man, they could launch coordinated strikes, like the infamous sack of Iona in 806, where monks recorded longships blackening the sea as they descended on the monastery. But these weren't hit-and-run raids. The Norse dug in, building fortified strongholds like the Broch of Bursay in Orkney, its stone walls blending Celtic and Norse architectural styles. Over time, these outposts became hubs of commerce, where Gaelic slaves, Icelandic falcons, and Arabian silver changed hands in bustling harbors. Language became the ultimate testament to this merger. Old Norse words seeped into Scottish Gaelic terms like strand, beach, and esger, scary, while Celtic storytelling traditions infused Viking sagas with tales of selkies and fairy mounds. The Galloway hoard, discovered in southern Scotland in 2014, captures this exchange perfectly. A 10th century treasure trove containing both Thor's hammer pendants and intricately knotted Celtic silverwork, all buried together by someone who clearly saw no contradiction in mixing the two. What emerged from this clash and collaboration was a new breed of Viking, one as comfortable quoting Gaelic poetry as wielding an axe. Figures like Godred Crovan, the 11th century Norse Gael king who ruled Man and the Hebrides, embodied this duality, his court a blend of skaldic verses and Celtic harp music. By the time the Scottish crown absorbed these islands in the 13th century, the line between Norse and Gael had blurred beyond recognition. The Vikings didn't just leave their mark on the Hebrides and Man, they became part of them, their legacy living on in the faces, place names, and stories of these islands to this day. The Viking fleet that appeared on the Seine in March 845 wasn't just another raiding party, it was a force calculated to paralyze a kingdom. Led by a chieftain the sagas call Ragnar Lothbrok, though historians debate whether he was one man or a composite of many, the Norse warriors sailed their longships upriver with chilling precision. Paris, then a smaller island settlement rather than the grand city it would become, represented more than wealth. It was the symbolic heart of West Frankish power under King Charles the Bald. The Vikings understood this perfectly. By striking at the capital, they weren't just seeking loot, they were demonstrating their ability to humiliate a crowned ruler in his own domain. What made this siege extraordinary wasn't just the scale of destruction, but the psychological warfare behind it. The Norse split their forces, sending one group to pillage the left bank while the main body stormed the fortified Isle de la Cité. Frankish chroniclers describe monks fleeing with relics as Viking axes shattered the gates of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, its treasures hauled away in full view of the king's paralyzed army. Charles, caught between rebellious nobles and an empty treasury, faced an impossible choice: fight and risk annihilation, or negotiate. He chose the latter, paying the Vikings 7,000 pounds of silver, a staggering sum worth roughly half the kingdom's annual revenue, to leave. This wasn't just a ransom, it was a blueprint for future extortion. The siege revealed a brutal truth about medieval Europe's political fragility. The Carolingian Empire, once Charlemagne's unified domain, had fractured into squabbling realms. Viking leaders like Ragnar or whoever commanded that fleet exploited these divisions with surgical precision. They knew Charles couldn't rely on his brother Lothair in the east for aid, nor on Aquitaine's rebellious counts. The Norse didn't win because they were stronger, they won because they recognized weakness. Within weeks of departing Paris, the same fleet was raiding Bordeaux, proving how ransom money fueled further attacks rather than stopping them. Archaeology hints at the raid's long-term impact. Hoards of Frankish silver buried across Denmark, some coins hastily chopped into pieces for smaller transactions, show how the Paris payout circulated through Viking economies. But the real legacy was strategic. For the next half-century, Norse fleets would replicate this playbook, sail deep into enemy territory, sack a symbolic target, then extort payment to leave. The Siege of Paris didn't just fill longship hulls with treasure. It taught the Vikings that fractured Europe would pay to make its nightmares go away until the day it finally decided to fight back. What's often overlooked is how this event reshaped Frankish defenses. Charles, humiliated but not foolish, ordered the construction of fortified bridges across key rivers to block future incursions, a tactic that would later thwart the great heathen army. The siege also accelerated the rise of local lords who could respond faster than distant kings, planting seeds for feudalism. Paris itself transformed. Its defenses expanded to enclose both banks of the Seine. The Vikings didn't just take silver that spring, they forced Europe to reinvent itself. Whether Ragnar Lothbrok truly led the attack matters less than what the story symbolizes. In Norse sagas, he becomes a mythic figure who wore magic trousers to repel snake venom, a fantastical detail masking a harder truth. The real magic was Viking opportunism, their uncanny ability to turn Europe's chaos into profit. When the longships finally withdrew from Paris, they left behind more than smoking ruins. They left a lesson. In a world divided, the boldest often write the rules and charge dearly for the privilege. When Viking longships first scraped ashore on Scotland's eastern coasts in the late 8th century, they weren't met with open fields or undefended monasteries. They faced the Picts, a warrior culture as fierce and enigmatic as the Norse themselves. These weren't passive victims waiting to be plundered. The Picts had spent centuries repelling Roman legions and rival Celtic tribes, carving their defiance into stone monuments covered in swirling symbols we still can't fully decipher. Their name, given by the Romans, meant the Painted Ones, a nod to their battle tattoos and indigo-dyed bodies that made them seem almost supernatural in the misty Scottish light. To the Vikings, they were both obstacle and opportunity, a people whose alliances could unlock the Highlands or whose resistance could turn a raid into a bloodbath. Early encounters were explosive. The Norse sagas describe the Picts as cunning fighters who ambushed from the heather, their small, fast horses outpacing Viking raiders weighed down by loot. At Birged, a massive Pictish fortress on the Moray Firth, archaeologists have found evidence of a brutal 9th century battle. Norse axes lodged in charred timber, Pictish symbol stones shattered by deliberate blows. But violence wasn't the only language these cultures shared. By the mid-9th century, a shift occurred. Viking graves in Orkney and Caithness began containing Pictish brooches, while Pictish settlements started yielding Norse combs and gaming pieces. Something more complex than war was unfolding, a grudging recognition of mutual interests. The turning point came with the rise of Norse Gael dynasties, particularly under leaders like Sigurd the Mighty, a Viking earl who allegedly strapped the severed head of a Pictish chieftain to his saddle as a trophy only to die from the corpse's biting teeth, or so the Orkneyinga saga claims. Apocryphal or not, the story hints at the intimate brutality of this cultural collision. Yet Sigurd's descendants didn't exterminate the Picts, they married them. Genetic studies of modern Scots reveal a striking pattern. In Shetland and Orkney, where Norse settlement was heaviest, up to 40% of male ancestry traces to Scandinavia, while mitochondrial DNA passed through mothers remains overwhelmingly Pictish. The Vikings didn't erase the Picts, they became them, blending traditions until the very name Pict faded from history. This fusion left marks deeper than DNA. Walk through northeastern Scotland today, and the landscape speaks in a hybrid tongue. Norse suffixes like Ness, headland, and Wick, bay cling to places like Thurso and Dingwall, while Pictish roots survive in prefixes like Pit, parcel of land, seen in Pitlochry or Pittenweem. Even Scotland's iconic symbol, the lion rampant, may owe a debt to this merger, with some scholars tracing its heraldic origins to Pictish beast carvings reinterpreted by Norse artists. The Picts didn't vanish, they dissolved into a new cultural alloy, one that would later shape medieval Scotland's kingship, laws, and even its rebellions. Perhaps the most poignant legacy lies in the stones. At Aberlemno, a Pictish cross slab stands just miles from a Viking burial ground. On one side, Celtic knots twist around biblical scenes. On the other, a shadowy battle unfolds, possibly the clash of Norse and Pictish warriors. But look closer, the interlacing patterns mirror those on Gotlandic picture stones in Sweden, proof that art, like people, refused to stay in neat categories. The Vikings who came to conquer stayed to create, leaving behind a Scotland that wears its dual heritage not as a scar, but as a tapestry. Far beyond the fjords of Norway, where the Arctic ice stretches endlessly under the midnight sun, lies Svalbard, a frozen archipelago so remote it wasn't officially documented until the 16th century. Yet scattered clues suggest Viking explorers may have ventured here centuries earlier, pushing their longships into waters no European had ever mapped. The evidence is subtle but compelling. Enigmatic references in sagas to a land called Svalbardi, meaning cold edge, where walrus herds crowded icy shores. Norse hunters chasing these prized beasts would have known the Arctic's rhythms intimately, the way summer thaws opened narrow channels through pack ice, the migratory paths of seals and whales that could guide a ship safely north. This wasn't blind exploration. It was a calculated pursuit of resources, driven by the same instincts that sent Vikings to Greenland and Vinland. Archaeology adds tantalizing fragments to the story. On Spitsbergen, Svalbard's largest island, researchers have uncovered driftwood with axe marks consistent with Norse toolwork, possible remnants of Viking hunting camps. More telling are the walrus skulls found in Scandinavian burial sites, their tusks carved into gaming pieces and jewelry. Some of these skulls bear cut marks matching Norse butchery techniques, yet isotopic analysis suggests the animals were harvested far north of known Viking settlements. Could Svalbard's rich hauling grounds where walruses still congregate today have been the source? The logistical challenges were immense, but so were the rewards. A single tusk could buy a farmer's entire flock back in Norway, making the perilous journey worth the risk. What truly staggers the imagination is how these explorers navigated such hostile terrain. Without compasses or detailed charts, Norse sailors relied on natural cues, the flight patterns of seabirds returning to nesting cliffs, the color shifts in ocean currents that signaled shallow reefs or open passages. They'd have known to hug the ice edge in summer, where melting flows created temporary waterways, and to watch for the telltale Hafjörðinga, a giant, slow-rolling waves that indicated distant storms. Survival in the Arctic demanded more than brute strength. It required an almost poetic understanding of nature's patterns, passed down through generations of fishermen and hunters. The climate of the medieval warm period, which peaked between 900 and 1250, may have made these voyages marginally easier. With sea ice receding further north than today, Svalbard's shores could have been accessible for brief summer expeditions. But this window wouldn't last, as the Little Ice Age descended in the 13th century. Thickening ice and fiercer storms likely severed this fragile connection, leaving only half-remembered tales of a frozen wonderland where the sun never set. Modern science is slowly piecing together the puzzle. Pollen samples from Svalbard's peat bogs show abrupt changes in vegetation around the Viking Age, suggesting human disturbance, perhaps from temporary camps. Meanwhile, genetic studies of Icelandic walrus populations reveal a sudden decline around 1100, possibly due to overhunting that forced Norse traders to seek new grounds further north. Each clue is a whisper from the past, hinting at voyages too extraordinary to be forgotten entirely, yet too sporadic to leave definitive proof. Svalbard's potential Viking visitors remind us how much of history is written not in stone but in ice, ephemeral, shifting, and waiting to be rediscovered. Whether these Arctic forays were isolated ventures or part of a broader tradition of polar exploration, they speak to the Norse mastery of their environment. The same instincts that guided them to America and Constantinople also drew them toward the top of the world, where the auroras danced and the ice sang. Long before whalers and miners stamped their claims on Svalbard, the Vikings may have stood on its shores, their faces turned toward the endless white, their longships bobbing in the freezing sea, a fleeting imprint on a land that forgets nothing. While most medieval Europeans saw the Atlantic coast of Africa as a forbidding expanse of endless ocean and scorching deserts, the Vikings viewed it as a highway to unimaginable riches. In the mid-9th century, Norse longships appeared off the coast of modern-day Morocco, striking at the heart of the Idrisid Emirate, a wealthy Islamic kingdom famed for its silver mines, bustling ports, and thriving slave markets. These weren't random raids, they were meticulously planned assaults on some of the most fortified cities in the medieval Islamic world. The Vikings didn't just brave the open Atlantic to get here, they mastered currents and winds that would daunt sailors for centuries to come, proving their reputation as the era's most fearless navigators. The raid on Necker in 859 stands out as a prime example of Viking audacity. Nestled along Morocco's Rif coast, this prosperous city was a cultural hub, home to scholars, artisans, and a royal palace brimming with treasures. The Norse struck with terrifying speed, their shallow draft longships slipping past coastal defenses to land warriors directly on the beaches. Moorish chroniclers describe the invaders as tall as date palms, their sun-bleached hair matted with salt spray as they stormed through the streets. But this wasn't just about plunder, it was a calculated strike at an empire already weakened by rebellion. The Vikings exploited political divisions, sacking Necker, while local factions were too preoccupied with infighting to mount an effective defense. What's truly remarkable is the journey itself. Sailing from their bases in Iberia, Viking navigators faced the Canary Current, a powerful northward flow that could drag ships into the open Atlantic if misjudged. They likely island-hopped via Madeira or the Canaries, using seabirds and cloud formations to guide them, just as they did in the North Atlantic. Once in Moroccan waters, they confronted new challenges: scorching heat that warped wooden hulls, unfamiliar diseases, and the absence of fresh water along the Saharan coast. Yet they adapted swiftly, trading with Berber nomads for supplies and learning to navigate by the North Star's position, which appears higher in the sky the farther south one travels. The long-term impact of these raids rippled across continents. Moorish rulers, stunned by the sudden appearance of northern raiders, began fortifying coastal cities and building watchtowers along vulnerable stretches of shoreline. Meanwhile, Islamic scholars like al-Yaqubi recorded detailed accounts of the Magus pagans whose ships materialized like ghosts from the fog. These writings preserve some of the earliest descriptions of Viking tactics from outside Europe. Their use of fire arrows to torch buildings, their preference for hit-and-run attacks over prolonged sieges. Archaeology adds another layer to the story. Silver dirhams minted in Moroccan cities like Fez and Sijilmassa have been found as far north as Dublin, evidence that Viking raids weren't just about destruction. They were part of a vast trade network spanning continents. Some of these coins bear bite marks, a Viking practice to test purity, showing how North African wealth circulated through Norse economies. Even more intriguing are the Moorish artifacts discovered in Scandinavian graves, intricately patterned textiles and glass beads that suggest cultural exchange went both ways. These African expeditions force us to rethink the limits of Viking exploration. While later European powers struggled to sail beyond Cape Bojador for centuries, the Norse had already proven it possible, not for empire or glory, but for the oldest motivator of all, opportunity. Their legacy in Morocco may lack the physical ruins of Greenland or the genetic imprint of the British Isles, but it's no less significant. In daring to sail where others wouldn't, the Vikings didn't just raid cities, they expanded the very boundaries of the medieval world. The NEPA River wasn't just a waterway, it was a Viking superhighway, a liquid corridor threading through dense forests and open steppes, connecting the frozen Baltic to the glittering domes of Constantinople. By the 9th century, Norse traders and warriors had turned this winding route into the backbone of a commercial empire, their longships cutting through Slavic and Khazar territories with a mix of force and diplomacy. These weren't casual explorers, they were empire builders laying the foundations for what would become Kievan Rus, the medieval state that gave birth to modern Russia and Ukraine. The journey was grueling, portaging boats around treacherous rapids, negotiating tolls with Khazar overlords, fending off Pecheneg raiders, but the rewards were worth every ounce of effort. At the heart of this expansion were the Rus, a mix of Scandinavian merchants and mercenaries who'd migrated eastward in search of fortune. The name itself tells a story, derived from the Old Norse term rather, meaning rowers or shipmen. It became synonymous with power in the east. Nestor's Primary Chronicle, a 12th century Slavic text, describes how these Norsemen were initially invited by warring Slavic tribes to bring order, a pattern echoing Viking mercenary work from Ireland to Byzantium. But the Rus didn't just impose rule, they integrated. At sites like Nezdovo and Staraya Ladoga, archaeology reveals Norse graves with Slavic pottery, Khazar coins, and Byzantine silks, proof of a cultural melting pot where axes and dirhams changed hands with equal ease. The Khazars, a semi-nomadic Turkic people controlling the lower Volga and Don rivers, played a pivotal role in this story. Masters of Eurasian trade, they taxed Viking flotillas moving down the Dnieper, taking a cut of everything from amber to slaves. In return, they offered protection from steppe nomads and access to Abbasid silver. This uneasy alliance wasn't always peaceful. Norse sagas recount clashes at Sarkel, a Khazar fortress on the Don, but it was pragmatic. The Khazars needed the Rus as middlemen for northern goods. The Rus needed Khazar neutrality to reach Byzantine markets. By the late 10th century, this balance of power shifted dramatically. The Rus Prince Sviatoslav, a figure straight out of saga lore, smashed the Khazar Khaganate in a series of brutal campaigns, seizing control of the trade routes his ancestors had paid to use. His victory opened the floodgates for Norse influence, culminating in the rise of Kiev as a metropolitan hub. Under rulers like Vladimir the Great and Yaroslav the Wise, the city became a dazzling fusion of cultures, its churches blending Byzantine mosaics with Norse woodcarving, its markets humming with Arabic, Greek, and Old Norse dialects. The legacy of these riverine journeys is etched into geography itself. The Dnieper's rapids bore Norse names recorded by Byzantine emperors: Afer, ever-roaring, Linti, laughing water. Viking ship rivets found near Chernihiv testify to the longships that once plied these waters. Most enduring of all is the DNA of modern Ukrainians and Russians, where Scandinavian haplogroups surface with surprising frequency, silent witnesses to a time when the fate of empires rode on the currents of a single river. The Vikings didn't just visit the Black Sea, they wove themselves into its history, their oars stirring the waters that would carry nations into being. From the frozen shores of Svalbard to the sun-scorched markets of Morocco, the Vikings proved that no ocean was too vast, no river too winding, and no horizon too distant to explore. Their expeditions weren't just about plunder, though there was plenty of that, but about threading together a medieval world far more connected than we often imagine. Picture this: a Norse trader bartering walrus ivory in Baghdad, a Varangian guard polishing his axe under the golden domes of Constantinople, or a shipwrecked crew sharing stories with Berber nomads around a North African fire. These moments weren't exceptions, they were the fabric of the Viking Age, a tapestry woven with equal parts ambition, curiosity, and sheer grit. What makes these journeys truly astonishing isn't just the distances covered, though sailing from Greenland to the Caspian Sea would be impressive even today, but the cultural collisions they spark. In Ireland, Viking kings became patrons of Celtic art. In Russia, they founded dynasties that would shape empires. In Andalusia, they left behind Arabic coins now unearthed in Norwegian soil. The Vikings didn't just take from the world, they gave back, introducing new technologies, trade routes, and even words that still echo in languages from English to Russian. Their legacy isn't just in the swords they swung, but in the bridges they built, sometimes literally, like the pontoon spans they constructed to sack Paris. Yet perhaps their greatest achievement was rewriting the rules of possibility. At a time when most Europeans clung to coastal waters, the Vikings treated the unknown as an invitation. They navigated by the stars when compasses were still centuries away, decoded wind patterns like ancient meteorologists, and turned their longships into floating laboratories of exploration. When they reached Vinland, it wasn't by accident, it was because generations of sailors had honed their craft, passing down knowledge like a sacred torch. That same spirit propelled them up the Volga, across the Mediterranean, and into the Arctic's icy embrace, proving that adventure wasn't just a destination, but a way of life. So the next time you hear Viking, don't just think of horned helmets and battle cries, though those have their place. Think of the first European child born in North America, Snorri Thorfinnsson, whose story was nearly lost to time. Think of the runes carved into the Hagia Sophia's marble by homesick Varangians, or the Greenlanders who chiseled church bells from soapstone as their world grew colder. These aren't footnotes in history, they're proof that the Viking Age was as much about discovery as it was about dominance. Now it's your turn. Dive deeper into these sagas of exploration. Which expedition amazed you the most? Was it Leif Erikson's accidental touchdown in Vinland, or the daring raid on Seville that shook the Islamic world? Share your favorites in the comments, and let's keep the spirit of discovery alive. After all, the Vikings didn't just sail into history, they carved it one voyage at a time. And who knows, maybe their stories will inspire your next adventure. Skal.